Hello my loves, and welcome back to another episode of Strange Playgrounds. Having a little bit of a flashback today in my pre-infection period. Not COVID, haven't had COVID, I've had something else, some sort of weird throat infection, which has laid me up for quite a while, and as you can probably hear, my throat still isn't quite right at the moment, but having a little bit of a flashback to a time many years ago when I was like in pre-double digits. I must have been about maybe 7 or 8, maybe even younger than that. And context is required to explain this phenomena. This is in the pre-internet days. This is pre mass availability of mobile phones. The notion of having a mobile phone at home was just nonsense at that time. It just, even the people who had mobile phones, it was insane. They were these big brick things that attached to like portable cases in order to charge up, and only CEOs and people from Wall Street had the damn things because they were ridiculous. And nobody needed them. Nobody really needed them back then, so they were not part of culture. But one of the things that was very popular in UK culture at the time were periodicals. They were like magazines on specialist subjects that you could order from particular companies. They would come through your newsagent, and each issue would be about a different topic or a different subject. Like, I used to collect loads of these when I was a kid. I used to have tons of them. There was one called Bugs that was very popular, which I had and I loved to bits. It talked about it had photographs of various different exotic bugs and spiders and butterflies, and it told you all about their life cycles and their natures, where they came from, whether they were venomous or not. And you could assemble like a plastic spider part of which came on each issue, and then you got binders to put the magazines in so you could refer to them. There was another one we used to collect called The Unexplained, which was very big at the time, like in the 1980s, early 1990s. There was this resurgence of interest in what I suppose would be called the paranormal, the supernatural, and all that gubbins. I was very interested in that when I was a kid. I'm very interested in it now. I don't believe in any of it, quite frankly. But I find the stories, the narrative aspect of it really fascinating, and what it tells us about humanity. But we had The Unexplained that was all about things like UFO encounters, ghosts, supernatural phenomena, psychic phenomena, all of that gubbins. It was really, really interesting. We've still got them somewhere, I do believe. And they were long-winded, these periodicals. They used to come like monthly, and you get an issue every month, and then you'd fill the binders up. I think like Bugs, there were like 12 different volumes of Bugs in the end, and The Unexplained was pretty much the same. There was this one that came out in, I believe it was the early 1990s. It was advertised on television and everything. It was really popular, but it seems to have been largely forgotten these days, called The Ancestral Trail. And The Ancestral Trail was really interesting in the sense that, first of all, it got a TV advert, which was very unusual for these periodicals. It was aimed largely at children of my age and my type, children that were already into mythology and fantasy and whatnot, who had like grown up with things like the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings and that kind of thing. And it was just like the periodicals I'd mentioned before, it was basically a monthly or bi-monthly issue, very, very thin, but very well-produced magazine that had each one of which was part of a story. It was part of a long narrative, which was very derivative. It was very sort of classic fantasy. It was The Lord of the Rings. It was a little bit of Alan Garner, The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, a little bit of C.S. Lewis, about a young boy named Richard who was thrown into a fantasy world that had this entire back mythology about the world, the metaphysics of this world, the ancestral world, as it was called, was held together by a tree of life, very like Yggdrasil, like pre-existing mythologies in actual human culture. And this tree of life, basically, it designated particular guardians from the various species of this ancestral world, who each of whom would be given particular powers and ownership or auspices over a particular aspect of that reality. So there was like a guardian of life, there was a guardian of reptiles, there was a guardian of insects, there was a guardian of nature, there was a guardian of light and knowledge, and all of that gubbins, you know. Each aspect of the world had a particular guardian assigned to it, and the tree would sprout these like purple pods that were like, they were the source of the guardian's power. But when Richard is thrown into the world, there's a cataclysm occurring where the tree is being assaulted by dark forces, and the current generation of pods have been stolen and scattered across the world. And in each issue, the emphasis of the quest that he goes on is that he has to discover each of the pods, discover their secret, so which pod they are, and then find the guardian to which they are assigned. The guardian, because of the scattering of the pods, the guardians to which the pods are assigned have like lost their minds and gone slightly mad. And each of the pods would usually be guarded by a particular monster that was the theme of that issue. And the monsters were really interesting. They were all derived from monsters in pre-existing mythology, and at the back of each of the issues there would be all of this interactive stuff. So there would be 2 cards that would detail particular myths from, say, Greek or Celtic or African or Hindu mythology, or from mythologies from all over the world, and you had to guess from issue to issue which of these mythologies the core monster from the story was based on. It was great fun. It was really interesting. I mean, being a kid who was already into mythology at the time, this was just jam. This was just the most wonderful thing. And each of the cards was detachable. You could clip it out and put it in like a little container called Morbane's Book of Myths and Monsters. And each of them had artwork of the monsters on them too. There was stuff like the issues were just full of the most brilliant artwork. The artwork in these issues is sublime. If I can find it, I'll put it up in this video. The artwork is absolutely incredible from issue to issue. And in each issue, there was all this interactive stuff. So at the back of each issue, there were games you could play. If you look through the artwork, you would find things like, there were these 2 creatures, these 2 lizard-like creatures called Shumi and Shubi, and they were hidden in each of the issues' artwork, and you had to find them. There was the big bad guy, who the Sauron of the whole setting, who is very imaginatively called the Evil One. Parts of his mask would be hidden throughout the issues, and you had to sort of locate them. It was great fun. It was a really interesting thing. In each issue, you got cards, and you could play games with the cards. It was almost like it was what would be recognized. Now, this was way before, by the way, anything like Magic the Gathering or anything like that, but it was that kind of game. This was long. It was more like a Top Trumps, you know, that kind of thing, that had artwork of the monsters, and they had statistics, and you could play different games with them. There were clip-out pieces of a map of the ancestral world that you could glue to like a foundation. And I remember doing that. I remember actually collecting all the pieces of the ancestral world and actually having that map for a time. I was quite obsessed with it. It was a really beautiful piece of work. The story wasn't any great shakes. It was very sort of derivative, you know. It was very standard fantasy. If you read fantasy fiction from that era, the sort of Tolkien derivative stuff, then you would understand it. If you knew mythology of any kind, then you would understand where the monsters came from. They were very clear where they came from. But what always struck me about it, I was often shocked by the artwork because it was really graphic. It was really gory and frightening. The monsters were not in any way sort of cartoonish. They were horrific. There's an issue, the second issue of the series, which is called Tolosh of the Garoon. The eponymous Tolosh are these weird critter-like organisms. They're like these furry creatures that they live in water, and when someone wanders into the ponds or the rivers where they live, they attack them like piranhas and rip them to pieces. There is graphic artwork in this issue of them doing exactly that, and there's images of them like biting bones and holding up organs, and the water is all bloody. This was aimed at kids, bearing in mind. There's a lot of horror in the Ancestral Trail. There's an enormous amount of horror. There are these consistent monsters called grapefruits that are like, they're these very, very large swarming insects that have a kind of mosquito thing. They have these long proboscis. And when they latch onto someone, they drain them dry of blood. And you see that happening in the artwork too. The third issue I always remember being an arachnophobe because it involved a giant spider called Baal. And there's a character who you've gotten to know quite well at this point, a sort of cat, like a leopard man, and he gets eaten by Baal, and there's this graphic artwork of him being skewered by the spider's pincers and held up. I was always shocked at how graphic and horrific the artwork was in the Ancestral Trail, but it was brilliant. Obviously, we loved that. As kids, we absolutely bloody loved that. It was I mean, one of the fun things about the issues, as I say, the story isn't really any great shakes. It's fine, it's compelling enough. It's a standard fantasy quest. It carries you along well enough. But the artwork and the monsters is really where it's at. I remember the renderings of the monsters and the names and natures of the monsters so clearly. Even though I was only like 7 or 8 years old when this thing was out, there's a monster I always remember called Claw, who's basically... the minute I tell you who he is and what he does, you'll know where he derives from. He's this skeleton. He's an undead skeleton. And he has this power where he throws his bones out across the sand and skeletal warriors rise up. He's from Jason and the Argonauts. He's the story in ancient Greek myth of the children of the dragon's teeth, right? The warriors that can arise when the dragon's teeth are scattered. That's what he's derived from. Such a cool monster. Such a brilliant monster. There was one called Narcum, the Fly King, and he was a gigantic humanoid fly who was... There was a picture of him that is so detailed and so brilliantly painted. All of these images, by the way, hand-painted. Every image in the Ancestral Trail was hand-painted, because this was... Although there was digital artwork at the time, it was well in its infancy at that point. It was very much in its infancy, and it certainly wasn't widespread, so the artwork was traditional. It was hand-painted, and it is gorgeous. It is absolutely beautiful. The artists in particular take great relish in rendering the monsters, obviously, because the monsters are where it's at. It's kind of an episodic thing. Every issue there was a new monster, and it usually featured on the cover, and they were always gorgeous. They were always amazing. Towards the end, there's one called my favourite, Cyrus, the Spirit of the Sky, who is a genie, and he's like a monstrous djinn. Absolutely beautiful creature. Dagmar, who's this gigantic dragon, the spirit of fire. It's all... I mean, it is really gorgeous. If you like fantasy, it's well worth going and checking out. It's not going to set the world on fire. It is nothing amazing, really, but it's very interesting. It's just a bizarre phenomena. It was very well regarded at the time, by all accounts. A lot of people I knew collected it. A lot of people did. It was very, very popular. And as I say, it did have a television advert, which was very, very unusual for this kind of thing. It did, at the end of its run, at the end of the fantasy run, when you had this incredibly climactic battle where all of the monsters came together and all of the guardians came together and they fought for primacy over the Tree of Life. And of course, the good guys win out, and it's all grand, and then the ancestral world is basically restored. You get a transition into an entirely new setting, which is a science fiction setting, and that's when I stopped reading it. Not because I have anything against science fiction in particular, but it felt like it was extending itself beyond its shelf life. I know a lot of people stopped reading it at that point, which is kind of a shame. It is kind of a shame. Looking back on it, I kind of wish I did keep reading it. I would have been very interested to see what science fiction tropes that it played with and how far it actually went, whether it kept going to the end and whether there was an end of the story of Richard's quest, But sadly, I stopped reading it at the end of the fantasy setting, and I kept those magazines for the longest time. There was a folder that you could put them in, like a cardboard folder that looked like an old book. I don't know what happened to them. They may still be at home. They may be in the loft somewhere at home at my mum and dad's place. I don't know, but I would dearly love to pick them up again. I wonder if they. I'm going to have to check out eBay and see if they're available. If people are do. I mean, I imagine these are collector's pieces now because they're not just magazines. They're not that flimsy. They're really. They're all like it's very solid, almost cardboardy paper that's really robust and really wonderful. And I really love the Ancestral Trail. I loved it throughout my childhood. I always used to go when it finished. I used to go back to it and read it through periodically. It's the kind of thing that I really loved, especially up to around the age of 11 when I started to discover things like Weave World and some of the darker fantasy that's out there. It was a sort of like a touchstone for me, something I would go back to quite a lot, if only just to look at the amazing artwork. And as I say, go check it out. Go and see if you can find the artwork in these issues, because it is, not only is it really good, considering it was aimed at children, it's quite shocking.